Well, if you would, take your Bibles and join me tonight and turn to the book of Genesis. We'll be in Genesis chapter number 22 tonight. Genesis chapter number 22. Hope you had a good day. We spent some time with fellowship with Pastor, and this morning he took me to his summer residence. I had no clue that he had a summer home, but he took me to this place. It was about an hour away. It's called the Greenbrier. And he took me through his gardens, showed me the house, and we even took a tour of it. And I was really impressed. I didn't know he got that perk being a pastor in West Virginia. No, we had a great time. We really did. It was a good time of fellowship around a meal, and it's just good to enjoy fellowship. Let me tell you something. Whenever COVID hit our churches, I realized something as a preacher. Back home for about 3 weeks, a lot of churches were in limbo when all of that first went down. But I'll tell you what I learned as a preacher of the gospel. I had learned in those 3 weeks that I had taken the fellowship with God's people for granted. I can still remember the first time our church had a meeting when all that stuff was getting straightened out. We were out in the parking lot. We had a parking lot service. I can still remember sitting in my truck, waving at other people in my church like a 5-year-old kid. I'd see somebody, I'd be like, and they'd look back and they would do that. And it really showed me that as a preacher, I've taken for granted the fellowship with God's people. And you know, there's several reasons you ought to be in every service here that you can. Obviously, probably most paramount is the preaching of God's Word, hearing from the Lord and letting God have His way in your heart. But I'm going to tell you, fellowship with God's people is a very, very important thing. And so I hope for all of you that it's something that you value, and I just enjoy fellowship with God's servants. And so often I'm encouraged by it. And you say, how do they encourage you? They just talk about what God's doing, and when they do that, it's just a great encouragement to my heart. But it's been a full day of fellowship, and I've enjoyed it very much. And I'm glad that you're here tonight. And we're going to begin reading in Genesis chapter 22. We'll read verses 1 through 3. In verse 1 it says, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place which God had told him." And in these verses that we've read tonight, they are the introduction to perhaps one of the most well-known stories in the Old Testament, where God asks Abraham, the father of the nation of Israel, to offer his son Isaac for a burnt offering. You know, some people tell me the Bible's a boring book. They say that because they've never read it. Folks, we're in the first book of the Bible, and we're already reading about something of this magnitude. And for all of us tonight, we hear the initial request of God, and we think that's too much to ask for. But I want to encourage you this evening to just listen carefully and see that all along God was at work in Abraham's life, and Abraham sets a tremendous example for every one of us in this room. When I get to heaven one day, I'd love to talk to Abraham and say, Abraham, I read about you in Genesis 22, and when God asked you to give your son Isaac as a burnt offering, I just couldn't believe it. And maybe Abraham would look at me and he'd say, son, I'll tell you, that's the hardest test I've ever taken. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what he said, because it was a big ask. Have you ever taken a hard test before? It's probably good to talk about tests now that these college students are out. I'm sure that students from Ambassador feel the same way. They're like, we don't want to see anything for a few months. But you know, when I was in college, I'm going to tell you, I love the true-false test question. if for no other reason, I had a 50% chance without even knowing the material. And we had one teacher, we called his test trick or fake, because he asked those questions in such a way you'd scratch your head and say, well, if he means this, it's true. But if he means this, it's false. But I did. I loved a good true-false question. There was another kind of question that we had. It was called a multiple-choice question. And I'll be honest, I didn't like those as much. Why? Because my odds to get the right answer were cut in half. We're not talking about 50% now, we're talking about 25%. But for my college friends that are here tonight, let me recall a grave mistake I made in my college career, and I pray that you never do the same. I liked true-false. I had taken multiple choice, and one day I was in a class, and a professor asked us, he said, guys, let me give you a choice. He said, would you rather have a test with 50 questions or a test with 2? And our whole class lit up with excitement. We said, of course, 2. 2. 2, that'd be great, just 2. And we showed up at the end of the week, and it was the first time in my life that I was ever introduced to an essay test. You know, it was so traumatic, ladies and gentlemen, I couldn't even tell you what the questions were. But can I tell you, question 1 felt like the teacher was saying, summarize the Old Testament in the next 5 pages. And then once you pick yourself up off the floor, question 2 is like, summarize the New Testament while you're at it. That's the way that I felt, but it was a devastating experience. I've never forgotten it. And you know, in my college years, I've taken a lot of hard tests, but I want to remind all of us this evening, listen to me, the hardest test that you'll ever take won't be in a classroom. It's going to be in life. And there are some of you tonight, you've been long out of high school, you've been long out of college, but that does not exempt you from being tested by God. And tonight, I want you to see from the example of Abraham, there's only one way that you can pass God's test. There's only one way to do it. Now, you say, well, that's nice. At least the answer is pretty simple. It's simple to say, but sometimes hard to live by. Listen to me. The only way that you can pass God's test, listen to me, is to trust Him with everything. And so tonight, I want you to see the test that Abraham experienced, and I want you to evaluate what's happening in your own heart and your own life right now. I can't help but think in a crowd this large that there's some of you this evening, you're being tested and you know it. And tonight, God is reminding you of the answer, and the answer is to trust Him with the dearest things that you have, with everything, and He will see you through. So this evening, the first thing I want you to see is what I call the description of the test. In a moment, we're going to look at verse 1, and we're going to see that there are 3 components that make up a test. You say, what is that? Well, if you're going to have a test, number 1, you've got to have a teacher. Number 2, you've got to have a student. And number 3, you've got to have a subject. I mean, if you're going to have a test, you've got to have those 3 things. You've got to have a teacher, you've got to have a student, and you've got to have a subject. So look with me again at verse 1 where the Bible says, and it came to pass after these things, here it is, that God did tempt Abraham. Now, I don't know about you, but when I see that word tempt, anytime in the Bible, immediately my flashers start going off. I say, boy, I'll tell you, that's a very powerful word. And I would say the vast majority of the time when you read that word in the Bible, the vast majority of the time it means a solicitation to do evil. Remember, Jesus was tempted in the wilderness of the devil. We even find the devil tempting David in the Old Testament. When we talk today, I would say probably 9 times out of 10, if somebody said, boy, I was tempted today, we would automatically assume that that was a solicitation to do evil. However, the word tempt in the Bible, there are 2 meanings. One is a solicitation to do evil, but the second meaning of that word is just simply to test. So now all of us tonight, we're in the quandary of which definition is it, but the Bible is the best commentary on the Bible, and it helps us to know the answer. Was this God soliciting Abraham to do evil, or was this God testing Abraham? This one verse clears it up. James chapter 1, verse 13, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and neither tempteth He any man. Isn't that wonderful? We get in the Bible, and it helps us to understand something that was written thousands of years earlier. And so make no bones about it. God's not saying, Abraham, I want you to do evil. Some of you are like, well, listen, offering your son for a burnt sacrifice, that doesn't sound good to me. All I ask you to do is, if you have that exclamation, just hear the whole message out first before you come to your conclusion. But He's testing Abraham's faith. And so who is doing the testing? The teacher is God. God is my Father. God is my rock. God is my shield. But I'm going to tell you, God's also my teacher. Have you ever had a teacher ask you to do something that you just thought was well nigh impossible? If you're a high schooler and your teacher's in this room, don't raise your hand. It won't set you in good stead with the teacher. But you know, sometimes a teacher will ask us to do something, and we're like, I don't know why they're asking me to do that, but it just sounds crazy to me, or you sometimes think it's out of spite. I remember in 10th grade, I had an English teacher, and every day was a bad day for her. I don't know why. I look back at it now, I don't know if she hated English or if she hated us, but it was obvious every day was a bad day. And she came into the classroom, we were reading the old English classic, Beowulf. You say, what was that about? I have totally forgotten. But in the course of doing that reading, she let us know early on, she said, now listen, I want you to know that at the end of this unit, I give a test, and nobody in the history of my teaching career has ever made 100 on that test. Well, I'm going to tell you, that's a real blessing to the class, isn't it? Just go ahead and dash all of our hopes. And so I made up my mind. I'm going to read Beowulf, and you know what? I'm going to do my best. And the day of the test came, and I remember sitting down in there, and it was multiple pages. And you know what happens at the end of the test? You start dealing with all those questions that you didn't know the answer to. Now, I was always somebody to put something in there. I wouldn't leave a blank because, you know, that's just a waste. I want to at least take a stab at it. And I still remember there was a matching section at the end of that test. You had the characters of the story, and then you had a characteristic about those characters. And I had a number of blanks there. My mind was a blank. And I still remember going down through that multiple choice section, and I would look over here, and I'd be like, boy, that sounds like I think that could be it. I'm just going to put it up there. But by the end of it, I was just like, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. I mean, it was just like grab one, throw it in there, and be done with it. And I'll admit, when I finished taking it, it was just a breath of fresh air. I thought, well, it's done. I'm part of the masses that have done poorly on this test, you know. A few days later, the teacher came in, and I'm going to tell you, she was as mad as a wet hen. She threw down that stack of tests on the table in the front of the classroom, and she said, I don't believe it. She said, somebody in this class made 100. Well, I'm going to tell you, as soon as I heard that, my eyes were affixed to the guys on the other side of the classroom that wore those thick glasses with tape and had lots of pins here, and I thought, I'm going to shake their hand when this is all done. Whoever busted her bubble deserves our praise. And I watched that teacher grab that 100 test, wander to the right side of the classroom, and put it right on my desk. I was in disbelief. My head was bowed, not in humility, but to hide my smirk. I thought if this woman only knew how I finished it. Random choices guided by God, I think. But here I am years later, and I hate to say it, but just sometimes a little illness rises up when I think about that woman. I think she just asked us to do the impossible, and probably the only thing that salvaged me is I made 100 on it, and it wasn't because of my academic prowess. You ever ask a teacher to have you do something hard to the point where you start questioning the motives of the teacher? Is this to make a name for yourself, or is this actually for my good? You know what I've found? I've found sometimes God asks us to do difficult things. And you know what we do, ladies and gentlemen? Whether we want to admit it or not, we doubt the teacher. Right now I'm dealing with a family member back home that's dying of cancer, and his wife calls me every other day or so. You know what? She experiences the emotions that everyone feels, and we talk, and you sometimes, and all of us get to that point, how am I going to make it through this? Or how am I going to handle this? And all we can say is we just know that the Lord will help us through. But there's sometimes maybe we experience a testing and it's been longer than we wanted, it's been deeper than we wanted, and whether we tell people or not, we start doubting the teacher. Listen to me, if you're here tonight and you found yourself in quiet moments doubting the teacher, I want to remind you, God loves you and He always has your best interest in mind. Very rarely does God's timetable match mine. I have to adjust to Him often. But I have to rest in the fact that God, His ways are higher than mine. But God was the teacher. But the student, Abraham, and can I tell you, Abraham was no flunky student. There's some students that are in the middle of the pack, but I'm going to tell you, Abraham, this guy's on the president's list. You remember how Abraham started following God? He lived in Ur of the Chaldees. In West Virginia, you folks have places like we do in North Carolina. You have names of towns that just sound a bit peculiar. Sod, Big Ugly, in North Carolina, Lizard's Lick. We've just got all kinds of names. But how would you like somebody to say, where are you from? And you said, Ur. That's where Abraham was from, Ur. That makes Sod seem pretty normal, doesn't it? Abraham was in Ur of the Chaldees. There was no Cranberry Baptist Church preaching the gospel. He had very little, listen, he looked up and saw the stars. He read the news and heard about God defeating all of these enemy nations. And Abraham places his faith in Jehovah in the midst of paganism and cuts and leaves everything and follows God. Now I'm going to tell you, if there's ever been a follower of God, it's Abraham. But here's the thing I want you to remember. You can mark it down. If God tested Abraham, you can mark it down. God will test any of us in this room. You say, well, I've been saved for 50 years. That's good, but you ain't out of class yet. You know what I find? I hit a stage in my life and I think, boy, I got it learned, and then all of a sudden, man, something comes. And God says, all right, you're going to the next grade. I'm like, Lord, how many grades are there? Some of you said, I've not set foot in a classroom in a long time. But listen, you're still in God's classroom. It's called life. If you're a Christian here, whether you're a carnal Christian or you're on fire, listen, whether you realize it or not, you're in God's classroom. He's trying to shape you. He's trying to mold you. You're a student. But then the subject. The teacher is God, the student is Abraham, the subject is faith. It's funny to watch people, you ask them, what's your favorite subject? Say, do you like math? And they're like, yeah. Do you like history? Oh, yeah. Do you like English? Oh, But the subject here is faith. The Bible makes it clear you're only saved by faith. For by grace are you saved through faith. That's the only way you get in. It's the only way you experience God's forgiveness. It's not works. Listen, there are enough churches in West Virginia. Some people say, there are too many churches in West Virginia. I'll guarantee you this, there's a lot more that aren't preaching the gospel than are. And there's a lot of churches, they preach works, they preach sacraments, they preach ceremonies. Listen to me, for by grace are you saved through faith. That's the only way you can get in. But can I tell you that subject, it's not just about getting in. It's about living the rest of your life that way. One of the most dangerous things that can happen to a church is when an older generation gets content with where they're at in faith and they refuse to grow. When that complacency sets in, you say, well, man alive, I'm going to tell you, I've done this for all of these years. That's great. Keep doing, keep working, keep serving. But listen, God wants to grow everybody's faith in here. A lot of times I challenge teenagers about their faith. Why? Because their whole life is ahead. And, I'm going to tell you, if there's ever a time to trust God, the sooner you trust Him, the better off you are. But it's something for every one of us in this room. And so the first thing we've seen is the description of the test. But now I want us to see where it gets very interesting, and I want us to see the difficulty of the test. There's times I've come out of a classroom, I said, that's hard. Why is this test so hard? Taking a cursory glance at it, we say, well, duh. I mean, look, God asked Him to take His Son and offer Him as a burnt offering. And that's the right general answer, but I want to break it down and see specifically why it was so difficult. Why was it so hard? Notice verse 2. And He said, take now thy son. You know what God was wanting? God was not wanting His vehicle. God was not wanting His financial income. God wasn't wanting His material possessions. God was wanting His own flesh and blood. I have 3 children. When all of my children were at home, if I was preaching in this church, and let's say back then Pastor Paulie was pastoring, and Brother Paulie said, hey, Brother Beal, I forgot to tell you, but here in West Virginia, when preachers come, and after they preach in a church, they have to give us one of their children and never see them again. And I looked at him, I said, well, that's all right, Brother Paulie, I got 3. As a matter of fact, take this one, he eats the most. I don't care whether you have 3 or 10, I would say all of your children are precious to you, right? Now, I want to say something to every parent and to every grandparent in here. Right now, I'm only a parent. I'm not a grandparent yet. I know my day is coming. But just like God wanted Abraham's children, or his child, can I tell you, God wants your children too. You hear about parents and they say, you know what, I gave my children to the Lord. Can I tell you, every parent in this room, every young parent, you ought to make up your mind that when that child is born, you realize that child's a gift from God and that child is God's. I was talking to a lady in Bristol, Virginia one time, and she told me after the service, she said, I'm going to tell you what. She said, I didn't have a problem giving my children to the Lord, but I'm having a big problem giving my grandchildren to the Lord. I didn't look at her and say, you heathen. You know what I told her? I said, ma'am, it just goes to show we're always letting things go, aren't we? We'll always have to do that. You know what God wants from every one of us? It's just very simply put, He wants the most precious things we have. He says, take now thy son, and then He says, thine only son. With every phrase now, God's whittling it down. It's just getting harder. You know, have you ever been in a conversation with somebody and the more they talk, the more you want them to stop? It's just getting worse. Abraham said, take now thy son, and then he says, thine only son. Now, some of you this evening say, preacher, that's not quite square. Because I remember what happened. Abraham and Sarah got ahead of God, and Sarah gave her handmaiden to Abraham, and Ishmael was born. And now God says, take now thine only son. I don't know if that's right. Let me tell you what's right, and I'm going to tell you why I know it's right. Because when God used that terminology, take now thine only son, He was being very specific. He was talking about the son of promise. There was only one that was going to be blessed. He was only going to bless Israel and bless a nation through one, and that one was Isaac. Now, with that in mind, I want you to understand the magnitude of what God has just asked Abraham to do. Basically, God has just asked Abraham to put his entire future on the altar. Because every last thing that God has promised him is wrapped up in that one kid. You're talking about all the marbles. That's pretty big. Folks, we talk about revival this week. I'm going to tell you, revival comes when people just start totally yielding to God and they have no reserves and they say, all right, God, here it is. A lot of times we hold on. He said, take now thine only son. He said, I want you to put your future. There's no future apart from Isaac. There's no future apart from the promise. And God said, I want you to offer him as a burnt sacrifice. And can I tell you, the very waters that God brought Abraham to in Genesis 22, I'm convinced that many of us need to cross them tonight. You know, one of the things I do everywhere I go, I try to encourage a younger generation to be willing to do anything for the Lord. My heart desire is to see an entire generation of young preachers and young ladies who are really willing to serve and to get the gospel all over the world. But I'm going to tell you, many people never hear God's call. You know why? Because they're not willing to put their future in God's hands. And whenever it frustrates me, I start remembering when I was a teenager and a stubborn-headed mule too. At times eating briars of the world and thinking I was having the time of my life, until finally, as a 15-year-old, I came to the realization, God, I don't know what you want me to do, but I know this, whatever you want me to do, I'll do it. That was the second greatest decision I ever made in my life. The greatest thing was salvation. Somebody says, where does your wife rank? Number 3. Some of you are like, well, I don't like that. Man, number 3, that ought to be number 2. I'm going to tell you why she's not the second best thing to happen to me. And the fact is, if I'd never given it all to God, I'd never found her to start with. Some of you young people tonight, you're like, I don't have any children. Well, that's good. You know, wait till you get about 40, get married, and then think about it. Parents, I'm trying to help you out here. Kids are like, oh, that's not funny. You're like, I don't have children. I don't have a house. I don't have much to give to the Lord. Let me tell you, young person, one of the greatest things you'll ever do is to put your future in the hands of God. But can I tell you, for every one of us, it's not just for teenagers. Sometimes we get a little older in life and things look a little dim. What do we have to do? We have to put our future in the hands of God. He said, take now thy son, thine only son, and then he just says Isaac. I think it's safe to say Isaac was a miracle baby. My mom was born with cerebral palsy, had me when she was 36 years old. And when I was just a little tyke, I can still remember we'd go in the store and my mom, she was so proud of me. My mom lived with us 6 years before she passed. And boy, she was my biggest fan. I remember one day my wife called me in the bedroom when my mom was living with us. She said, Alton, come in here. I want to talk to you for a second. I said, what's wrong, honey? She said, are you really as perfect as your mother says you are? I'm going to tell you, there's no fan like Mom, you know. But Mom would go around and she'd point to me and she'd say, "That's my miracle baby." And the reason she'd said that is because she wasn't in a physical position really to be able to have a healthy child. And I was going to say normal, but that's objectable. Some people say, I don't know about the normal part. But she would go around and she'd use that designation. She said, "That's my miracle baby." Can I tell you, there's never been a miracle baby like Isaac. It'd be like if you were going to the nursing home ministry. I don't know if your church has it or not, but when I was a kid, our teens would go to the nursing home. Imagine with me, you're going through the nursing home and you come to a door and the placard says, "Miss Sarah," and there's a blue balloon tied to the door. You knock on the door and you open it and there's a lady. It's in July, but she's got the heat running over there and she's got a bundle of blankets right there in her lap. And you see her and you say, "Hey, Miss Sarah." You know, sometimes you have to raise your voice so they can hear you. You say, "Hey, Miss Sarah, how are you doing?" And she looks at you and says, "Shh, this baby's sleeping." And you look at her and say, "Oh, Miss Sarah, I'm sorry. I bet you that's a pretty baby doll you got." And she looks at you with a little consternation and she said, "This isn't a baby doll. This is my child. Just had it last week." You step over there and you see that plump pink flesh and you see that baby's hand move and you step back and you say, "Oh, it's good talking with you, Miss Sarah. We'll see you later. Service at 2 o'clock. Hope to see you." By this time, you're backing out. You're trying to find the new youth pastor. You're like, we're not in a nursing home, buddy. We're in an insane asylum. That woman's as crazy as a person I'd ever seen. You're scurrying down the hallway. You're looking for the youth pastor, and you run into a guy, and he's got a walker with tennis balls on the 2 back legs, and he's scooting down there with blue balloons tied to his walker. You don't put 2 and 2 together. You look at him, and you're like, "Sir, we're trying to look for our youth pastor. That man with a beard, he's just walking around. He's a young fella. Doesn't live here. We need to find him. We really need to talk to him." And he says, oh, what's wrong with you?" "Oh, we just went down here and talked to a lady who had a blue balloon tied to her door." And Abraham says, "It's okay. Just last week at the age of 90, my wife had a baby boy and I'm only 100. You want to talk about a miracle baby? I mean, that was quite the feat. There's so many facets of this diamond. Listen to me. Abraham and Sarah were willing to give up a miracle for God. But here's the last thing. "Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac," here it is, "whom thou lovest." Folks, I'll admit sometimes the devil is my biggest problem, but sometimes myself is the biggest problem. And I get to where I hold on to things more than anything else because I love them. Maybe I should clarify that, because I love them more than God. You know, I love time with my family. I love a good steak. I love a baseball game. I can say I love a lot of different things, and those loves are not inherently evil. But you know what? God sometimes asks us for the very thing that we don't want to give up. My son Jared, when he was a kid, he loved the dollar store. Those dollar stores come out everywhere. I'm convinced the next time we land on the moon, there's going to be a Dollar General up there. They will have beat us there. But I used to give my son Jared 5 $1 bills and send him into a Dollar General, and he felt like a king. Inevitably, he was going to come out with a gun, army men, and play sludge that you just played with in your hands. Felt gross. You know what? He'd take that cheap dollar stuff and he'd get back in the car. And I'm going to tell you, there were a few times on the way home that gun would break. After all, it was only $1, and he's back there sobbing up a storm. I'm like, before my boys moved out, before they got older, I'm telling you, we had a whole bucket full of plastic guns that had been duct taped from where they had broken. There were more duct tape than plastic left to them. But I'm telling you, it was just cheap. It's easy to give cheap stuff, isn't it? Oh, here's just an old little cheap trinket. But God, He asked Abraham, He said, I want you to give me what you love. Now, folks, I want to ask you tonight, is there an Isaac in your life that's holding you back? Young person, it may be tonight. It's your life. You've been afraid. You've been fearful. You've been scared. And there's not a person that can do more with your life than God. And tonight God says, put your future on the altar. It may be some of you tonight. It may be a parent. You need to put your child on the altar. It may be a grandparent. You put your grandchildren on the altar. It may be something that you're facing. And you say, Lord, this is the last thing that I want to let go of. And tonight Jesus says to you, lovest thou me more than these? Now, before I give you the last point quickly, I want to talk to you about a point of argumentation that sometimes people make. There are some people, and they say this. They say, I do not like this story, and I think that God was wrong. There's some people, and they'd say, you know, God had no right to ask Abraham to do that. He was asking Abraham to kill his own child, and they say, I take great exception to that. When I hear somebody who raises that exception, do you know what I say to them? I know what some of you would say to them. Some of you would say, go talk to my pastor, you know. But when somebody comes to me in protest and they say, God was wrong in asking that, I say to them two things. Number one, I say, did God actually have Abraham kill his child? And the answer is no. But the second answer is just as important, if not more. I tell them what you fail to realize is what God asked Abraham to do in Genesis 22. He did thousands of years later for sinful wretches like you and me. Every one of us would be in hell tonight apart from God's grace. You want to talk about a life in shambles and a life in ruin and a life with no forgiveness, life without Jesus, life without the cross leads you to a dead end. And if you leave here tonight unconcerned or undesirous to know about the fact that Jesus Christ died on the cross, God's only Son, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. And my friend, He died a sacrifice on the cross. His blood was shed for your sin and mine. And if you're here tonight and you've resisted God and you've never been saved, this story ought to point you to the fact that God did more for you than any human being could ever do. And tonight He wants to save you. Tonight He wants to cleanse you. Tonight He wants to give you peace. Tonight He wants to give you joy. And instead of being a skeptic about what God has done, come to Him in faith tonight. Number one, the description of the test. Number two, the difficulty of the test. But the last thing I share with you is the discovery of the test. You know, things have gotten so high-tech today, I hesitate to use this illustration because a younger generation, it just goes right over their heads. But you know, there used to be a time back in the good old days when you went to school, they sent home paper report cards. You usually got them at the end of every quarter. Now, for some of you, it wasn't paper, it was stone and chisel. Now they probably email those things, and then the kids don't have a chance to hide it from their parents. But But I'm going to tell you what, my mom, she knew every time those report cards were coming home. I don't know if they sent out a memo in my notes or whatever, but I'm telling you, Mom would come to me and she'd say, hey, later on this week your report card's coming. I can't wait to see it. Fills you with apprehension when you know you haven't done your best. And I'm going to tell you, when I had a good grade, I couldn't get home fast enough. March in there and show the world, hey, look at this, pat me on the back. But I still remember in 7th grade, it was the first time I ever made a C in algebra. And it wasn't because I had brain power or a lack of brain power, I had a lack of willpower. Man, I looked on that report card and I got a C. It's interesting, my dad dropped out of school in 6th grade, but he expected me to be Einstein. But I'm going to tell you what, when I got that C, I got sick in my stomach. That was the longest bus ride I ever had home. School bus stops at my house, what seems like 30 minutes. I finally get up, backpack on my back, and I just shuffle my feet slowly down that long, narrow aisle. I come over to the bus driver and I look at her like it's going to be the last time. And then I just marched down the steps, walked down that long gravel driveway. We lived in a mobile home. I snuck up those steps there, and I just sort of stood there for a little bit listening to see what was going on inside. When I thought the coast was clear, I quietly opened the door. I slipped in. My back turned towards most of it. I'm almost to the bedroom, and Mom just jumps out of a closet somewhere. Where's it at? You know. Well, I'm going to tell you, when you get a bad grade, it's not good. But Abraham got a good grade in this. And I want to show you what it was. Look a little later in the story in Genesis 22. And I want you to see the grade that God gives him. In verse 10, and Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do anything unto him. Here it is. For now I know that thou fearest God. You want to know the first part of that grade? God said, Abraham, you fear me more than anything else. You know what holds us back from sometimes putting our Isaacs on the altar? We fear losing Isaac more than we fear God. We fear losing something that is so precious when in reality, God is trying to do a greater thing and we fear the wrong thing. There's some of you tonight, you know what's holding you back maybe in your Christian life? Maybe some of you, you're on the verge of being able to break through and to go forward, but there's some stronghold that's in your life. And tonight, God has asked you to set it aside, and you fear losing that more than you fear God. Sometimes it's not sin. Sometimes it can be a good thing, but it's holding you back. It's keeping you from going to the next level spiritually. You've made an idol, and the problem is that you fear losing that more than you fear God. He said, For now I know that thou fearest God, and notice the end of the verse, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. He said, Abraham, you're willing to give me everything. Let me tell you, this message just isn't for teens, it's for adults too. You know, I can beg teenagers and say, listen, you need to make sure that you just put your life on the altar and say, here it is. But I'm going to tell you, to us adults, there's times God has a way of bringing things to our attention that we've held on to. My oldest son, when he was about 8 or 9 years old, he had a year where his nose was stopped up for like 4 months. My wife and I, we thought, it's good old North Carolina allergies, just getting him broke in. And one night my son was laying on his back on the floor, and I was laying on his chest, and I happened to look up. When I looked up in his nose, something didn't look right, and I told my wife, I said, take a look at this. And you know how we parents are. We get all curious, we're poking and prodding, and he couldn't stand it. And we said, we better go to an ear, nose, and throat doctor. That doesn't look normal. And so we took him to the ear, nose, and throat doctor. His name's Dr. Coder. He's no longer there. He practices in another state. And my son, he was just in there all giddy and happy. It was just sort of like, and my wife and I were a little bit thinking, what's going on? And so Dr. Coder got in there and he looked around, and after looking around for a little bit, I'll never forget it, he set my son off to the side and let him play. And he said, Mr. and Mrs. Beal, he said, I want to tell you what I just saw I've never seen before in all of my years of practice. He said, your son has a large nasal polyp in that cavity that has almost filled it up. And he said, it's happened so quickly. He said, it could be cancerous. And he said, we're going to have to get that out as soon as possible. And he said, this could be extensive. Now, I'd love to tell you that when I left that doctor's office, I looked at my wife, unbuttoned my shirt, and said, we're super Christians. But after I paid the bill, I couldn't even talk to my wife on the way out of the car. Son's sitting in the back seat, and he's making noises and racket like kids do. And I'm not even looking over at my wife. I'm looking out the front window, and I'm looking off to the side because my eyes are pulling up with tears. And I'm thinking to myself, that is not what I wanted to hear. That night was rather quiet at our house when our boys went to bed. My wife went to bed. I just sat up in a pitch dark living room. And man, I'm going to tell you, I sat there and I just wrestled, and I just sat there and I said, Lord, there's just a lot of questions I had and there were no answers. And I'll be honest, that night I started thinking ill about the teacher. And as I was sitting there in that living room that night, God brought back something to my memory that I'd forgotten about. When my first son was born, we lived in a little mobile home. And he had a Winnie the Pooh nursery on the other side of the trailer. Because of the amount of traveling that I did, none of our children were ever formally dedicated in a church service because it seemed like we were always on the go. But with every one of my children, and Andrew was the first one, I'll never forget picking him up out of that Winnie the Pooh crib. My wife and I stood there, young new parents. Listen, folks, I was an only child. I got an education having a child. And that night we sat there, and I'm going to tell you, I don't remember exactly what I prayed, but it was probably something like this. Dear God, we have no clue what we're doing. We need your help, and this child is yours. Lord, save him at an early age. God, use him for your honor and glory. And we basically said that night, God, he's yours. And after that memory flashed through my mind, it was like the Lord said, did you really mean that? And that night I just had to bow my head. And I said, Lord, you've taught me a lesson this evening. Folks, can I tell you this evening? God still tests us in this area of faith. And if you're going to go forward in the next step in your faith, you've got to be willing to put your Isaac, your future, or whatever it is on the altar. Let's bow our heads together in prayer. Our heads are bowed, our eyes are